Welcome back to Crime Pod. I saw this story and knew I had to do a video on it because I've got a connection, not to the little boy, but to the place where he went missing from. In 1994, I started working at Butlins in Pwllheli, North Wales. For those of you that don't know what Butlins is, it's called a holiday camp, and it was a chain of seaside resorts in the United Kingdom that were to provide affordable holidays for British families, started by a man called Billy Butlin. So in 94 I got a job there and I went to work there, and I loved it so much I went back for the following season in 95, where I met my husband and we married, and the rest, as they say, is history. So Butlins has and always will have a very special place in my heart. But one of the things we used to do, or spend a lot of time doing, was finding parents for children. Very often, when I worked on the fair, I worked on the shies in the middle of the fair where you threw a hoop and won a toy, and the kids would come up and say, "Excuse me, miss, my mum's lost," or "My mum and dad's lost." And so you'd go off with them and you'd find their mum and dad for them, and 9 times out of 10 they were either in the crowd just a little bit away, or they were usually in one of the bars having a drink and didn't know that the little scallywag had wandered off. So this story for me is a lot harder to listen to because it just shouldn't have happened. Somebody should have stopped him getting out of the camp, and that's what I can't come to terms with. September the 17th, 1988 was set to be one of the happiest days in the brief life of Stephen McKerron. The 5-year-old from Hamilton, Scotland, was on a week's holiday in Ayr at the home of his aunt and uncle, Lynn and Ian Snedden. He was eagerly anticipating his visit to Ayr's Wonderwest World Holiday Park, a seaside amusement centre featuring rides, games, entertainment and all the other features guaranteed to thrill the heart of any lively little child. For some 3 hours Stephen had the time of his life at the crowded merry park, and then, suddenly, the unthinkable happened. While the boy was playing on an escalator, the Sneddens, each thinking that the other one was watching him, briefly lost sight of Stephen. Although he was only out of their view for a matter of seconds, it was time enough for him to vanish completely. The increasingly frantic Sneddens quickly searched the park, but found no trace of the child. They then went to the park security team, who in their turn called police. The hunt for Stephen McKerron was the largest missing child search in Scotland's history. A 6-mile radius around the park was searched by hundreds of officers and volunteers. His description was widely circulated. Divers searched local rivers and water tanks. A special helicopter was brought in and had heat-seeking equipment that could detect a body. It all did no good. Stephen appeared to have vanished into dust. The publicity brought in several alleged sightings of the boy. One person claimed to have seen a distressed-looking Stephen in a Wonderwest World cafe several hours after he went missing. He was in the company of a middle-aged man. Another park visitor said he saw a boy matching Stephen's description climbing Wonderwest World's 7-foot-high fence. A number of motorists believed they'd seen Stephen walking along the Ayr Thurnbury Road about a half an hour after the Sneddens last saw him. Whether those reports were credible or not, they were of little help in finding him. After a few days had passed, the police admitted that they were desperate for leads. The assumption was that Stephen had been kidnapped. He was a happy child with no motive to run away, but that didn't square with the eyewitnesses who claimed to have seen him wandering alone. In any case, where was he? Stephen's loved ones were left tormented by horrible suspense until over 2 weeks later after he vanished, when their worst fears were realised. On the afternoon of October the 2nd, a woman was walking her dog in open country near her home at Beoch, I think, over 6 miles from the holiday park. She was stunned to come across the dead body of a little boy. He was lying in a fenced ditch about half a mile away from 2 farmhouses. When the police arrived on the scene, they quickly confirmed that Stephen McKerron had finally been found. He was lying just outside of the search area. It was ruled that he'd died of exposure. There was no sign that anyone had harmed him in any way. Authorities believe that Stephen had walked to the site alone, 6 miles over some of the most difficult and unappealing countryside in Scotland, full of marshes, hills, gullies and thick woods. A local described it as hellish territory. It would have been hard for a strong adult to walk so far through such an area. For a 5-year-old, it seemed virtually impossible. The police came in for a good deal of criticism for not making their search area a wider one. A department spokesman retorted with, "How far do you go?" Law enforcement pointed out that their search area had been based on previous experience as well as professional estimates on how far the boy could possibly have travelled on foot. What happened to Stephen was, quite simply, beyond anything anyone could have imagined. The puzzle of Stephen's disappearance and death was, of course, far from solved. His distraught family insisted that he could not, have walked to this remote site on his own. They believed that someone must have abducted the child and then left him in the ditch to die. His father also highlighted the odd fact that when Stephen's body was found, his socks had been removed and were in his pocket. Mr. McKerron pointed out that his son didn't know how to tie his shoelaces. Not only would it have made little sense for Stephen to take off his shoes, remove his socks and then put his shoes back on, he couldn't have done it anyway. Of course, it makes no sense that anyone else would do it either. The question at the heart of the tragedy, namely, why Stephen would voluntarily leave the park at all, was also impossible to answer. An official inquiry was held in March 1989 before the local sheriff, Neil Gow. After considering the various theories involving foul play, that someone had kidnapped Stephen and left him in this remote spot to fare for himself, or killed him and then dumped his body in the ditch, Gow ruled that the boy had simply died a strange but completely natural death. Stephen's enterprise and stamina had been seriously underestimated by all concerned. The sheriff concluded that for whatever unknowable reason the boy had wandered away from the park and continued to hike until he collapsed and died. As far as the authorities were concerned, the case was closed. Jerry Gallagher, 59, was part of a team tasked with finding the lost 5-year-old Stephen McKerron. The police search was heavily criticised when Stephen was found dead 16 days later. To this day, Jerry is still haunted by the missed chances that could have saved his life. Very early in an officer's career, the realisation dawns that no matter how hard you try, you cannot simply solve every crime or bring every incident you face to a successful conclusion. Even more so if the situation or crime has involved a child or some other vulnerable individual. Although there were initial concerns that Stephen may have been abducted, they were offset by a witness who saw a boy fitting his description and wearing the same clothes climbing a 6-foot perimeter fence. There were further sightings of a boy walking alone on a road towards nearby Ayr. Search parameters were established by senior management and assistance was eventually sought from the RAF, which provided a helicopter equipped with infrared sensors. I was one of the scores of detectives drafted in to assist by interviewing staff and guests. I'm sure most of the inquiry team was satisfied that Stephen was missing and not the victim of foul play, but that didn't make things any easier. The surrounding area was bleak, cold and marshy, and he was only a child, woefully underdressed for the conditions and nighttime temperatures. In the belief that he was lost, I found myself sometimes delaying inquiries I'd been given, just so I could take a drive around the surrounding terrain in the forlorn hope that I'd catch sight of him or maybe hear him call out. Not long into the investigation, I needed to speak to a procurator fiscal at Glasgow Sheriff Court about an unrelated matter. As I stood waiting, I began a conversation with a sergeant. That chance meeting and the resulting conversation would bring me into conflict with the senior officers in charge of Stephen's disappearance. It almost led to me being thrown off the inquiry, and it remains a source of regret that I could have been more forceful in my arguments. The sergeant had previously worked on a similar type of inquiry involving a missing boy who was roughly the same age. In that case, however, the boy, also on foot and alone, had managed to walk a far greater distance than the area designated for search in Stephen's case. At the briefing that evening, I relayed this new information to senior management and expressed my belief that the allocated search parameters were too narrow. I was told that experts had been consulted when establishing the search area. The expert was, in fact, a paediatrician. When I suggested that consulting a topographer would be more beneficial than a paediatrician, and reiterated the distance covered by the boy in the other case, I was met with icy glares and even icier responses. "That's the advice we've been given, and that's what we'll stick to," I was told in no uncertain terms. By this time I could feel colleagues almost creating a physical space around me as a means of distancing themselves from my suggestions. Throughout my police service, I'd never shied from conflict, and besides, this was too important to remain silent about. I forcefully made my point again, that a different type of expert should be consulted and have the search parameters redrawn, but I wasn't going to alter their opinions. As I made a final futile effort to change their minds, I was nudged by a colleague who whispered to me, "Shut it, you're about to get binned." In other words, thrown off the inquiry. On October the 3rd, 1988, some 16 days after he'd gone missing, Stephen was found dead by a passing hill walker. He was curled up in a ditch, possibly trying to shelter from the cold. He was 6 miles from the camp and 1 mile out of the established search parameters. If a chain is only as strong as the weakest link, then the chain relating to Stephen's disappearance was weak from the outset and remained that way for the length of the inquiry. There were so many what-ifs, and had some of them been acted upon, Stephen's life might have been saved. Why didn't Stephen's aunt and uncle keep a closer watch over him at the camp? Why didn't the person who'd seen him climbing a fence to the outside of the camp intervene? Why didn't any of the 4 motorists who saw a small, unaccompanied young boy walk in a busy road not to check to see if he was okay or tell the police? Why did the police limit the search area to 5 miles and take 3 days to make use of a specially equipped helicopter? Why wasn't I more aggressive in demanding the search area be extended? The only salve to my own conscience, I suppose, is that no matter how much I protested, the senior officers in charge had made their minds up and would never have changed course. At the subsequent fatal accident inquiry, the officers in charge conceded that should the same situation arise, they would adopt a different approach. Why do I think Stephen ran away? I think he was a little boy who was missing his mother and father, who was homesick, and who was trying to make his way home to Hamilton, which makes the whole incident even sadder. As I said, some inquiries remain with you.